Maliss now in Master Duel has been showing up everywhere in rank, so how can we deal with it? With Dogmatika! Let's rip cards straight out of their extra deck before they even come out. But this isn't just any Dogmatika build. We're bringing in Mimighoul to give Dogmatika a helping hand. So here's how it went. Alright, duel number 1, and I'm going first. My opening hand isn't bad. I've got Mimighoul Dungeon as my starter and Dogmatika Ecclesia as my extender. The plan is to lead with the Mimighouls to hopefully eat up my opponent's interruptions, then transition into Dogmatika since their combo line is a bit more fragile. Luckily my opponent doesn't seem to have interruptions, so I start slapping Mimighouls on the field. Since I control an extra deck monster, I can transition into Dogmatika using Dogmatika Ecclesia. She searches Dogmatika Matrix, which gets its full effect because my opponent controls a monster. Using Dogmatika Matrix, I peek into my opponent's extra deck and find out that they're playing Maliss. So of course I rip out Maliss White Binder. Now that I've got White Knight Dogmatika on my field, I can also rip out another card each turn when my opponent activates a card effect. I have to Ash the Lair of Darkness since that's basically Pot of Greed 2.0 for Maliss. Because they activated a card effect, I also get to rip another card from the extra deck, which had to be Maliss Red Ransom. When fighting Maliss, I've learned that I have to interrupt them as soon as possible. They've got a gajillion ways to extend once they start banishing. So I use Dogmatika Fleur-de-Lis to negate White Rabbit since that would let my opponent extend further. Go Dogmatika Fleur-de-Lis! And I guess that worked. Woohoo! I won! Alright, duel number 2, my opponent's going first. My hand is looking pretty good. I've got Mimighoul Maker as my starter and the Dear Servant as my extender. As usual, I want to bait out any interruptions using my Mimighouls. My opponent has 3 cards in the back row, which definitely makes me think this is either Labrynth or Dinomorphia. I need to be careful about Transaction Rollback in the grave since it'll be live as soon as another trap hits the graveyard. My Mimighoul line gets interrupted, so it's time to pivot into Dogmatika. Unfortunately, I don't control a face-up extra deck monster anymore, so I can't go into Ecclesia right now. Okay, so my opponent is playing Labrynth. Ripping cards out from my opponent's extra deck is no longer a win condition. Instead, I need to focus on keeping their Labrynth monsters off the field. I had to use Call by the Grave on Kikalu since that would most likely dump more Labrynth floaters into the grave. Go! Call by the Grave! By the end of my turn, I don't have a super strong board, but I just need to keep my opponent's monsters off the field. I use Mimighoul Room to lock my opponent out of normal summoning, as long as Mimighoul Dungeon stays on the field. Go, Mimighoul room! But fortunately my opponent pops Mimighoul dungeon, which means that they can normal summon again. Things are starting to look bad, but I've got one trick up my wall. Go, Mimighoul Maker! My opponent probably forgot about the Mimighoul dragon I set on the field, which is a game changer. Now that it's back to my turn, I know I need to stop my opponent from recovering, which Labrynth is notorious for. The main threat is the big welcome Labrynth in the back row, especially when it's empowered by Labrynth. I really didn't mind Mimighoul dungeon being destroyed since I've got Dogmatika Matrix and Dogmatic Calamity for extending. I feel like I can push for a win this turn since my opponent spent half their life points using transaction rollback last turn. So I bring out White Relic of Dogmatika. Woohoo! I won! Alrighty, duel number 3 and I get to go first. What's awesome about Mimighouls is that they can place themselves onto my opponent's field, which not only plays around infinite impermanence this turn, but also lets Dogmatika Matrix gain its full effect. Oh, oops. It's at this point I realized I probably shouldn't be blindly banishing my opponent's deck when everyone's playing Maliss. I basically handed my opponent a +2 right here. On the bright side, my opponent doesn't seem to have any hand traps, so I can safely transition to Dogmatika. Go, Ecclesia! Since they're on Maliss, I need to rip out Maliss White Binder and Maliss Red Ransom from their extra deck as soon as possible. I can deal with White Binder this turn by using Dogmatika Matrix, and I'll leave White Knight of Dogmatika to rip out Red Ransom next turn. Because my opponent activated a card effect, I can now rip out Red Ransom from their extra deck. Go, White Knight of Dogmatika! It looks like my opponent is starting with a Math Mech line. I know I have to prevent Access Kotak from hitting the field since it not only destroys my cards but also acts as an extender for Maliss. I decided to negate Maliss White Rabbit since that provides access to annoying Maliss trap cards. Go, Dogmatika Fleur-de-Lis! But of course Maliss always has a bajillion extenders. I use Little Knight to banish Trans Kotaker since I know that my opponent will use it to summon Axis Kotaker. Go, Little Knight! At this point, I've run out of interruptions and I'm hoping that ripping White Binder and Red Ransom will at least slow my opponent down. And even after all that, they still managed to bring out Access Code Talker. On the bright side, White Binder and Red Ransom are nowhere in sight, so stripping them out did help, but Maliss being at Powerhouse still did a lot of damage. Things aren't looking good. If I don't draw some starter next turn, I pretty much lose. Nice, Mimighoul Maker! Now it's all up to my Mimighouls to push for game this turn, since this is definitely my last turn. I'm actually so glad Decklist gives Dogmatika monsters an extra 500 attack because it gave me just enough damage to wipe out my opponent. Woohoo! I won! Alrighty, duel number 4 and my opponent's going first. I drew absolutely no starters, but at least I have both Maxi and Fuelos to help me draw some cards. Alright, so my opponent is playing Vanquish Soul. I know Vanquish Soul likes to special summon from the hand, so I'm saving Maxi for when they do. Go, Maxi! What's interesting is my opponent had Ash Blossom the whole time, but they probably wanted to save it for the Vanquish Soul effects. Luckily for me, I have Called by the Grave to deal with Ash Blossom on my turn. I have Ecclesia to go into my Dogmatika line, but ideally I'd like to start with my Mimighouls first. It's a good thing that I have Triple Tactics Thrust because that lets me grab Mimighoul Maker. Go! Triple Tactics Thrust! When it comes to fighting Vanquish Soul, their main weakness is when they have no monsters on the field to tag out, so I want to make sure that Mimighoul Dragon destroys all their monsters. Go, Forbidden Droplet! There could only be one Incinar problem for my Mimighouls, but it would be a problem for my Dogmatika, so I definitely need to deal with it. Go, Little Knight! Now that there could only be one is out of the way, I can go into my Dogmatika line. Go Dogmatika Ecclesia! That I forgot about is that I can't attack directly this turn due to Little Knight's effect. Oh, oops. Since I'm not winning this turn, I might as well set up White Knight Dogmatika for interruption on my opponent's turn. Vanquish Soul doesn't rely too heavily on the extra deck, but there are a few cards that I like to rip out, particularly Rock of the Vanquisher. My opponent could have just destroyed Little Knight without using Fenrir's effect, but because they did, I can chain with Little Knight. Go, Little Knight! I decided to rip out Zeus for my opponent's extra deck since they have 2 copies of Rock of the Vanquisher still there, so ripping one out wouldn't do much this turn. It sucks to see my White Knight and Little Knight get destroyed, but now my Cartesia can use her effects since White Knight's restriction is gone. Go Cartesia! Unfortunately, I can't use Lulu Lilith to negate Rock of the Vanquishers when it's summoned, since Rock of the Vanquisher can just chain to it. Things are looking pretty good. I have both Mimighoul Dungeon and Dogmatika Matrix to get more resources. The main thing I need to watch out for is Kashtira Fenrir's banishment after I activate a monster effect. I don't mind Albazoa getting destroyed because I can just bring him back with Dogmatika Macabre. I might as well rip out the last copy of Rock of the Vanquisher so my opponent can't summon any more of them. And now I can negate Fenrir from activating its effect this turn. I was off a little bit in damage. Since I wasn't going to win this turn, I decided to rip out more cards from my opponent's extra deck to a point where it's practically useless. Vanquish Soul is pretty good at recovering if you give them a chance, so I need to interrupt them as soon as possible. With Mimighoul Dungeon on the field, my opponent can't normal summon, and that was enough to beat my opponent. Woohoo! I won! Alright, duel number 5, and I get to go first. Not the best starting hand, but at least I have Mimighoul Dungeon as a starter. At this point, I'm hoping Triple Tactics talent gives me another starter. Well, this definitely wasn't great. I figured that White Relic of Dogmatika is still worth summoning since she can rip a card out of my opponent's extra deck. My only real form of interruption is Mimighoul Room, so I really have to make it count. Alright, so my opponent's playing Maliss. I have to use Mimighoul Room on Maliss Dormouse before her ignition effect goes off, and that actually seemed to stop my opponent surprisingly. What's awesome about Mimighoul Room is that it has an engrave effect to help Mimighouls dodge targeted interruptions. Go, Mimighoul Room! I definitely need to use Forbidden Droplet on Maliss White Rabbit as I need to keep the Maliss trap cards off the field since they can be activated the turn that they are set. Go, Forbidden Droplet! Now I can go into my Dogmatika line using the Deer Servant. And I guess my opponent didn't feel like sticking around. Woohoo! I won! Whew, playing ranked is tough. With Maliss everywhere, it's definitely been a struggle. There are plenty of duels where if Maliss goes first and I don't have Artifact Lancia, Maxi, or Fuelos, I pretty much lose the duel. But on the bright side, combining Mimighoul and Dogmatika actually works surprisingly well. Here's the deck list I've been running. It's a 60 card build that probably could use some tweaking, but honestly, I think it's not too bad. Maybe you might want to give Mimighoul Dogmatika a try. Anyways, bye bye!